When we think of Los Angeles, California in the 21st century, most of us will imagine a playground for the rich and famous, a stunning metropolis that is one of the most iconic and breathtaking cities on the planet. One night in the early 1940s though, the city found itself at the centre of an intriguing UFO encounter, one which saw the military open fire on a vehicle seemingly from another world. In the early hours of 25th February 1942, at around 3 AM, residents of Los Angeles were dragged from sleep by the sound of air raid sirens announcing an attack. As families hurried to various homemade bomb shelters, the sound of anti-aircraft gunfire could be heard, coming in sporadic but regular and very purposeful bursts. This alone brought back the fear most West Coast Americans had felt since the attack on Pearl Harbor a little over 2 months earlier on the morning of December 7, 1941. An attack that not only destroyed several ships, as well as causing many fatalities, but ultimately dragged the United States into World War II. Those who didn't have shelters to head to, or simply weren't concerned enough to utilise them, would spill out onto the previously sleepy streets. Unbeknown to the confused and panicked residents of Los Angeles was that US Navy radar had picked up an unidentified object around 120 miles to the west of the city and had been tracking it since shortly after midnight. By 2:15 AM, anti-aircraft stations were put on standby. Several minutes later, with the object still approaching, they would receive a green alert telling them to be ready to fire immediately. What many people who stepped from their houses first noticed was that despite the barrage of automatic fire heading skywards, there were no enemy fighters falling out of the sky in flames. In fact, it didn't appear there were any enemy planes at all. Nothing swooping and descending, nothing sending short rattles of fire downward. What many did see, however, was the vague shape of a huge oval object. An object that appeared to be the target of military gunfire, except nothing seemed to impact on it. Instead, it appeared as though some kind of invisible shield was around this equally mysterious craft. During the 3.5 hours until just after 7 AM, when a sense of normality arrived with the light of the morning, numerous and varied reports would circulate, both among the military and throughout the wider community. There had also been several fatalities. All of the dead were civilians, some the victims of traffic accidents, while others had heart attacks likely caused by the very surreal events. Perhaps of all the witness statements over the years, one of the most intriguing came from a woman known only as Katie, who would speak of the encounter years later. She would prove to have one of the most unique perspectives of the events, partly as she worked as a volunteer air raid warden at the time. So when her phone rang in the early hours of 25th February, she already had an idea that something was likely afoot. On the other end of the line was her district air raid supervisor. There was, they said, an immediate alert, and rather more intriguing, they wished to know if she had seen anything unusual in the sky, more specifically near to her home. Katie lived not far from Santa Monica on Los Angeles' west side. Upon being asked the question, she walked over to the window of her living room. She would later recall that what she could see was huge, and it was almost right over her house, just hovering there. She would further recall that the mysterious object was a pale orange, and it had an eerie quality to it. Partly because there was no other competing light due to the blackout, the object would shine spectacularly in the dark black sky. It was around this time that the US military searchlights found the object in their glare. Like many of the other witnesses, Katie would declare with absolute certainty that fighter planes were sent up. She watched them approach the object in groups and then turn away, their firepower seemingly ineffective. According to Katie, the planes would make several approaches, but each time would suddenly retreat. Katie would continue to watch events unfold from the relative safety of her living room for close to half an hour. Then the object began to move away, eventually disappearing into the night. She would recall that several direct hits impacted upon the surface of the object, however no damage at all was visible. In fact, it would appear as though the huge shell simply fell to the ground at the last minute. Retired anthropology professor Scott Liddleton, who was only a young boy at the time and whose father was also an air raid warden, also had an almost perfect view of the events. He would describe the object as like a lozenge, with artillery shells exploding all around it. Also, like Katie, he would claim the very real presence of American fighter jets. In fact, Liddleton would prove to be a strong voice over the decades that followed regarding the encounter. Indeed, he just may prove to be one of the key witnesses. He would describe the Battle of Los Angeles as a night that a UFO was fired upon by the US repeatedly with no apparent effect. He would further state how the entire region was on constant alert for attack, and that practice runs along the beach took place with purposeful targets dragged along the skies for gunners to aim at. There were also regular blackouts, which Littleton's father as a volunteer air raid warden would get prior notice of. During such blackouts he would have to don his hard hat and patrol the streets in his designated area, ensuring that all curtains remained closed and all lights were off. Generally speaking, these practice runs went relatively smoothly. However, in the early hours of 25th of February, it appeared that the system totally collapsed. When the shelling began in the early hours that morning, Liddleton at first thought it was another late-night practice run. As he looked out of his bedroom window, however, he could instantly make out the searchlights sweeping around the night sky. Among them was the bright flashes of exploding rounds. This further pushed away the notion that what he was seeing was a drill. The explosions during the practice runs were usually quite a way out to sea, and these were much closer. According to Liddleton, his father couldn't understand why he or other local air raid wardens didn't receive word, whether it was a drill or a real attack. All local air raid wardens should receive notification to attend their positions. Now this could be an important point. Littleton's father would place several phone calls to the Civil Defence headquarters in a bid to find out more information. Nobody, however, would pick up. He would make the decision to take to the streets as per his duties of his own accord. We might recall the alarm was raised sometime around 2:15 AM. However, as we will remember, Katie was notified a little after 3 AM. In fact, she would receive questions as to whether she could visually see anything from her position. Again, this is simple speculation, but might it have been a purposeful decision to keep as many of the air raid wardens inside? Might they have wanted as few witnesses as possible? Ultimately, Littleton's father ordered the entire family into their basement. After they had all done so, however, he went back outside, and discreetly, Liddleton followed him. Both of them stared up at the silver lozenge-shaped craft as it simply hung motionless in the air. Then, it began to move slowly away, heading towards Redondo Beach, southeast from their location. They would watch it for several minutes before it disappeared out of sight. Many other residents of the same area also saw the object as it made its way over Los Angeles, seemingly unconcerned with the barrage of gunfire aimed at it. There is also the suggestion that the Battle of Los Angeles encounter could have been an exercise in disinformation, or at the very least, authorities had some kind of prior knowledge of the events. We might recall once more that Katie received notice of the object before any other air raid wardens, and she wasn't the only one. Several radar operators, for example, would state in a television documentary in the early 2000s that they received prior warning from their superiors to expect a target coming in, and once they picked it up, they were to track it. One would even go as far as to say it was an advanced weather balloon with a wavelength of wire tied to it so the radar would pick it up. Does this suggest there was a purposeful operation in place, or is this simply a case of a mistaken sighting by the radar operator in question? Or is this possibly a case of disinformation? How, for example, would the balloon explanation match up alongside Katie's sighting? Or might Katie's claims be disinformation to take away from secret military action? After all, she was a volunteer air raid warden. Perhaps she would see it as her duty. Or perhaps the fact that several civilians died prompted this speculative cover-up. Of further interest are two little-known encounters from the previous month that attracted military attention on the evenings of 9th and 11th of December 1941 respectively. and while it is not known if there is a connection to that evening in February 1942, they are certainly worth noting. The first took place to the north of Los Angeles in San Francisco, a relative stone's throw away. According to the main witness, General Ryan, several strange objects came out of the sea, causing the US Navy to send out 3 vessels to investigate just what the objects were. He would state to the Times-Union newspaper that he didn't know how many planes there were, but there were a large number. Given that Ryan claims planes came out of the sea, we can likely replace the word plane with UFO. Remember, a phrase still a decade away from its eventual interweaving into the fabric of American popular culture. 2 nights later, in Los Angeles, another blackout took hold of the city, and once more, this was not a practice. It was a little after 7:35 PM when the alert signal turned yellow. This indicated that an unidentified airplane was approaching the city, and what's more, it was approaching from the stretches of the Pacific Ocean. All air and naval bases would go to instant alert, with anti-aircraft posts put on standby along the waterfront. Shortly after, several response planes would leave the runways of their respective airports to investigate this strange oncoming object. There was no known interception, although several witnesses claimed to have heard the sound of gunfire. No explanation was ever given for what this mystery object might have been. That something significant took place between 2 AM and 7 AM on the 25th of February 1942 is without question. Was it a military exercise that broke down among confusion and panic? Or was there indeed a UFO, a craft from another world, hovering over Los Angeles while the military fired their comparatively primitive weapons at them in a blind panic? Perhaps there was a sudden realization that humanity was simply ill-prepared for these cosmic visitors. Maybe this is the reason for the plethora of cover stories, denials and general disinformation, all of which has polluted the UFO subject for decades. Might this event even be the first time in our modern era such otherworldly intelligence made itself known, and just what might be the consequences of our collective and aggressive reaction? A reaction undertaken by a minuscule percent of the planet's population, and authorised by an even tinier percent of that. That thought alone should be a sobering one.